This is the dome at Greenwich, designed by Richard Rogers, court architect of the New Labour movement, to house the Millennium Experience, which opens on the 1st of January next year. It aims to celebrate New Britain's strong and joyful leap into the next 1,000 years. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, was the last designer to try and build a dome on anything like this scale. It never happened. His client committed suicide, and the 1,000-year regime the dome was meant to celebrate missed its target, thankfully, by a mere 988 years. The Greenwich Dome is an altogether more innocent monument. Unlike Albert Speer's, it is only ever meant to be temporary, and despite its name, it's more a giant circus tent than a traditional monument. And yet, like previous great containers of people raised to celebrate national events, it has social and political ambitions to tell us Brits who we are, how we live, and where we might be going as we enter the next millennium. I'm going to be travelling back in time through the last 150 years, hoping to discover and understand what first fueled this desire for mammoth exhibitions. History won't feature much in the dome, but unless we learn from it, we're fated to repeat its mistakes. I think each of the great British exhibitions had a different role and character. The nearest to us in history is the Festival of Britain on London's South Bank, the chance for the government to prove to the people, 6 million came here, that Britain could make it, despite losing an empire and facing near bankruptcy at the end of the Second World War. Back further we find the Wembley exhibition, which was visited by 17 million people, and designed to prove that the British Empire was here to stay, and in a world in which Britain was no longer top dog, that the colonists were needed more than ever for their raw materials and markets, if not for their culture. Here's the site of the Anglo-French exhibition at Shepherd's Bush at the time of the Entente Cordiale between France and Britain. 8.5 million people paid to come here, King was on his throne, a pound was worth a pound, the average life expectancy of a British working man was 52, and the First World War would have seemed pretty unlikely. And so we come back in time to our starting point. Our story begins here in London's Hyde Park. This is the site of the Crystal Palace, the foundation of every great exhibition worldwide ever since. The British were the first to hold an international fair, filling this one phenomenal glass building. It was exactly 1851 feet long, matching the year of its creation, yet the greatest structure of its age lasted just 6 months. Today, not a trace remains. Although it's gone, we remember this building. It was truly radical. Nothing like it had been seen before. Isambard King de Brunel planned a giant brick dome for the site, but not only was it ugly, it could never have been built in time. The Great Exhibition was a rush job. The problem of how to design a suitable building was solved not by an architect nor an engineer, but by Joseph Paxton, son of the head gardener at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire. Paxton had built a much-praised glass house for Chatsworth's exotic lily pond, the design of which he had based on that of the leaves of the lilies themselves, the lightest possible structure for the greatest surface area. He sketched out a proposal for the Crystal Palace on a piece of blotting paper whilst attending a meeting of the directors of the Midland Railway in Leicester. The famous railway engineer Robert Stephenson was at the same meeting. On the journey they shared back to London that day, one of the most influential buildings of all time took shape. It was a brilliant solution, a prefabricated building realised in iron and glass, 300,000 sheets of glass, a third of all the glass made in Britain at the time. Britain was backward in glass making. The tax on windows had only recently been repealed, and the only way Paxton could meet his target was to buy in glass workers from France, who were paid over the odds for their skill. Each pane had to be hand-blown, hand-fired, and transported the 110 miles from Birmingham to London. They were installed at great speed by gangs of fitters moving along the trusses of the iron building frame in miniature railway wagons. The glass building had come of age. Unwittingly, the global modern architecture of our own century had been born. Two giant elm trees stood in the way of the construction of the Crystal Palace. Now, Paxton wasn't allowed to chop them down, so he built over them. And in doing so, he raised the transept of Crystal Palace to 108 feet, which is where we are here. That gave the building its distinct and unusual profile. There was one problem, though: birds. The birds loved the elm trees, and they flew into the palace and did what birds will do. Queen Victoria called for the Duke of Wellington to solve the problem. "Sparrowhawks, ma'am," he said, and sparrowhawks were forced into the Crystal Palace, and they sorted out those feral pigeons and cockney sparrows as surely as the Duke had sorted out the French at the Battle of Waterloo. The media of the day devoted unprecedented coverage to the exhibition. Until then, the greatest public spectacles had been public executions, which on the right day, the hanging of a toff perhaps, could draw crowds of up to 200,000, 6 times more than the Greenwich Dome plans for an equally good day. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was a peerless crowd puller. In the course of 6 months, 1 in 3 of the adult population came to Hyde Park from all parts of the country and from abroad by brand new steam railways to marvel at the might and industry of Britain and her trading partners. The Talking Telegraph. The Colt Revolver. Samuel Colt bagged an order for 4,000 guns for the Royal Navy. A machine for making envelopes, easy enough for the working child to operate. Mr. Bouquet's stuffed animals. A frog shaving his companion, Queen Victoria's especial favourite. The Kohinoor diamond, now part of the Crown Jewels, transported from India by armoured steamship. Mr. Sax and the first saxophone. A vacuum coffin to keep the dead fresh. A floating church for sailors. An enormous lump of coal. Any firm could apply to put its wares on show, although many were turned down, including one for a flying machine. Confident, blousy, and even exotic in parts, the Great Exhibition was all about openness, transparency, and self-improvement. Much of this improving stuff was only really suitable for display in museums. It was, I suppose, the Victorian equivalent of an ancient Roman victory celebration. In bravura halls, the ambition and fantasy of the burgeoning British Empire and the spoils of international free trade and the muscular business enterprise that drove it were put on unparalleled and lavish display. Clive, I've got here a telescopic view of the Great Exhibition. I wonder what you make of what you see through there.
Well, it's a rather strange and dramatic sight, isn't it? But of course, this is before the department store had been invented. So there was no chance to go to a large place and see a whole range of things. Not a pleasant sight, necessarily.
Not a pleasant sight. It looks like a complete jumble. I mean, was the Great Exhibition a jumble of things?
In many ways, yes. I mean, it had never been done before. And it was trying to represent every aspect of manufactures. I don't think it would have been as much of a jumble if you'd actually walked round. And remember those 6 million people walking through. Why should they stop at the stand with your products on it? So the firm that made this, the firm of Leisler, really pulled the stops out in the months before the exhibition. Got all their best workmen on it. They found lots of marvellous Austrian timber, and they produced a large and dramatic show-stopping thing. There were 30 classes of objects. Each class had a committee that chose, and then, rather like at a flower show, people went round before the exhibition opened and awarded medals. So in each class there was a gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal, honourable mention, and that starts at 51. If you're thinking of buying a teapot, you could go around the exhibition and see which one you preferred. So it was a wonderful chance for the public to just shop.
What were the most popular exhibits?
Well, the Greek slave was probably the most popular because there was a lot of debate about whether it was obscene or not, because people said that it was rather shocking to have this full-size female nude in the middle of the exhibition. But then it was explained, and it was wonderful copy in the newspapers in terms of getting people in. It was explained that she's a Greek slave in a slave market about to be sold to the highest bidder. But in fact, it's a deeply moving Christian allegory, because if you look terribly closely, she has a crucifix in her hand which will protect her from the awful things to come. So it was actually one's duty to come and see it as a Christian allegory.
But presumably the gentleman did look very closely.
Well, and it was shown against a red velvet curtain.
What have we got here? What the butler saw?
No, it's Queen Victoria receiving a bouquet on the occasion of the laying of the foundation stone of the V&A. The museum was funded by the enormous profit generated by the Great Exhibition. It sited on what was farmland in South Kensington, a case of ploughshares into culture, market gardens into mass education. The Crystal Palace was far more than the sum of its hundreds of thousands of parts. It left a legacy that's been feeding us with ideas, museums, and student scholarships ever since. In 1851, the arts and sciences were still bound together. We tend to think of the Great Exhibition as principally a show of overwrought decorative art, yet it was also a demonstration of Britain's engineering and experimental genius, of steam locomotives, pumping engines, agricultural machinery, medical equipment, and other devices as ineffable then as they remain today. In fact, Britain was probably far better in 1851 at science and technology than it was in the decorative arts. The stores for the Science Museum at Wroughton in Wiltshire, housed in a squadron of former Second World War aircraft hangars, hold some of the pickled fruits of Victorian invention, including some of the last physical links with the Crystal Palace itself. Virtually nothing survives of the original Crystal Palace, but these cast-iron components are about as close as we can get. They come from Oxford Midland Station and were built the same year, 1851, as the palace itself. They were designed by Fox Henderson, the engineers, and they are about as light and as advanced as technology got at the time. The downpipes here you can hear hollow, and so light and so easy to manoeuvre that any workman with any DIY skills could screw them together quite easily. And that's why it was so easy to build the palace so quickly. More than that, the speed at which the components were made was quite phenomenal. This pipe here, for instance, could be taken from the foundry in Birmingham, and in just 18 hours from its state of being piping hot, taken down by a railway and horse and cart to the site in Hyde Park. 18 hours, that's quicker than we could do in 1999. At first, the plan was to upend the long structure, keep it in Hyde Park, and transform it into what would have been the first skyscraper. But as it was to be another 20 years or so before Mr. Otis invented the lift, the only way up would have been by a rather challenging cast-iron spiral stair. The Crystal Palace was always meant to be a temporary building, yet its prefabricated design meant that it could be dismantled and moved anywhere anyone wanted it to go. It came here to Sydenham. We know this leafy suburb as Crystal Palace. In its new form, the palace gave pleasure to millions, 2 million a year in its first 30 years at Sydenham, a true people's palace, although it never turned a profit, as it had done in its debutante season in 1851. The building was greatly enlarged when it came to South London. Its Brobdingnagian scale was matched by the range and ambition of the entertainment it offered. In 1936, the dream was over.
And finally, the huge skeleton of ironwork twisting and falling. Hold your breath. For 85 years, the Crystal Palace has been a playground and a landmark of London. We mourn its loss.
It was the fate of great exhibitions to vanish in a puff of smoke. Somehow the transparency, the innocence of the Crystal Palace seems a long way behind us. Over the next 150 years, exhibitions were to become increasingly spun and doctored, the plaything of politicians. The British created the first of the great international exhibitions, the Crystal Palace of 1851. The idea developed rapidly through intense international competition, but it was the French who took it to new heights.
The greatest of all exhibition monuments wasn't universally popular. In fact, when it went up in 1889, its fiercest critics came here, sat down, had picnics. They said it was the only place in all of Paris you couldn't see it. The Eiffel Tower was a huge attraction. It was a real show-off building that brought people here in their millions in 1889, and it's still doing that, of course, today. It's often forgotten, though, that it was built as a temporary structure. It was only meant to last about a decade. Well, here we are over a century on, and as you can see, and as you can hear, Parisians are still working to make it look as good as new.
We're looking now down at the Champ de Mars, which was where most of these exhibitions were held.
But they weren't just didactic, were they? They weren't just there to teach people. They were also, more than that, good fun too, weren't they?
They were very powerfully premised on pleasure, and I suppose we're standing here on the Eiffel Tower. It's the largest piece of pleasurable engineering I suppose ever created. So yes, pleasure was an enormously important aspect of the French shows, but education, national identity, economy, all those things were also important, and they felt they could embroil it all together. The French took the tradition and pushed it onto an absolutely epic scale.
The Lumiere brothers brought the 1900 Paris exhibition together for posterity in these early film reels. They captured the dreamlike architecture of the exhibition stretched along the banks of the Seine, as well as the show's inventiveness. Here's the dual-speed travelator that took some of the 48 million visitors around the site. And then there were the popular entertainments, funny, ephemeral things. Olé, flamenco, France Sevilla. A feathered plume of strutting bigwigs. Cows from the land of the cuckoo clock. A beauty pageant. Some larking about by the stand-up comedians of the time. A nod from Monsieur le Président. And here's Britain's contribution, Tiny Titch. The avant-garde composer Stravinsky was so taken by Tiny's show that he wrote him some music. One of the surprises of the Paris and later shows was the display of exotic peoples from across the new empires. Sadly, I could find no first-hand accounts of the people themselves, but what I did learn is that a Parisian antiques dealer specialising in Chinese antiques, erotica and opium pipes was writing a book on the subject.
If you look at this picture, you see an African village. You see Europeans here, and a lady speaking to the baby, but that could be taken in Dakar, in Gorée, everywhere. But where is it taken? Ta-da-da, 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 stuff! Under the Eiffel Tower. That's surrealism. How could you build a black village under the Eiffel Tower? But people don't care. They were going there, they paid 1 franc, which was a lot of money, to get in and to see how these people were living. It's like, and that the aim of an exhibition, to show how the others are living. I don't say I agree on that. The name of my book will be Human Zoo. It's terrifying. But in this time, it was bon enfant. It was 100 times less hard as we find it now.
Was there a little bit of almost soft pornography in the presentation of the people? I noticed the black African women, for instance, always seem to be naked.
That's part of the money. An ugly picture. Here are the girl with the breast out. Here is the salle des machines. That's colonial mentality. You can see a woman and you can see the breast. And it's the other one. Means it's not a white. It couldn't be my wife. It's another one.
But the people did know that they were playing a part.
Sure. One man, one black, was called by the director and say, you are too kind, you don't have to smile every time, you have to let them know or believe that you are a cannibal.
So the people had to pretend they were inferior to the French people?
No.
No?
Different, not inferior. The French say they are inferior. But as for them, they look at French. And who built the village is Monsieur Barbier here, surrounded by all the troop. And he's wearing a white Panama.
Because the Frenchman.
With un canotier, très chic. Bon, and these people smile.
So this was the model, Gerard, for the village.
And this model was taken by everybody in France. And he got a lot of money. And for instance, he was the man, not him, but the man who followed him, to send the Senegalese at the English exhibition.
Which exhibition was that?
1908.
It's hard to believe. Replica mud huts from Senegal in Shepherd's Bush in West London. The idea came from Edward, Prince of Wales, and his son George, who were so taken with the 1900 Paris exhibition that after the death of Queen Victoria, they helped plot an even bigger show for London. It was to celebrate the Entente Cordiale, a friendship of the French and British people. Everlasting friendship was commemorated in a rather impermanent medium of a sculpture carved in butter. It was a hugely popular show. About 8.5 million visitors came here in 1908. White City was a short-lived fantasia, an Edwardian version of Disneyland. Imagine 7 huge pavilions, a gigantic machine room, interspersed by ornamental gardens. Unlike the Paris shows, it was a reusable exhibition site. The buildings were planned by the Hungarian engineer Imre Karelfi. They were simple concrete boxes hidden behind fairy tale facades. This is the Porte Monumentale, Shepherd's Bush. It was designed by a well-known French architect, according to the 1908 catalogue, but it forgot to mention his name. Some idea of what the forgotten halls look like can be seen in a set of coloured postcards sent to a Robert Robinson Esquire. The sender had come to see the 1910 Japanese-British exhibition here. We went to the exhibition on Monday the 11th, and this is the first place one enters. The passage from Uxbridge Road is converted to a series of beautiful tableaux representing Japan in spring, summer, autumn and winter, beginning with winter. After winter, one enters another section, and one's eyes delighted by a burst of spring colouring and cherry blossom. A transition to summer is imperceptible. Singing birds are concealed amongst the excellently imitated foliage, and the illusion is as perfect as art can make it. These rather skinny sumo wrestlers demonstrated their skill in one of the concrete sheds at Shepherd's Bush that stretch a quarter of a mile along what is now the approach road to the elevated A40 motorway. Back to our postcards. After autumn one comes to exhibitions of military and naval matters of all sorts, models of ships, etc., and armour and medical outfits for war, and then to 1, the anthropological, 1 nice skull and aboriginal bones and flint implements, 2, chemical, bottles full of chemical compounds, which didn't interest me, 3, medicinal cases full of microbes, mosquitoes, funnel worms, biomozones, elephantiasis, and all sorts of internal objects, 4, geological selections, coal and such, sulphur, and other geological and mining products. A rather smart indoors tennis club has taken over some of the halls. But other cathedral-like spaces here are nothing more than aviaries for London's pigeon population. Beneath 2 inches of urban guano, you can see through holes in the concrete floor to railway lines 30 foot below. This is the end of the halls today, but they went even further, across Wood Lane and into the gigantic part of the exhibition that almost no one seems to remember. Postcards recall it, though. People used to send them the way we make telephone calls or send emails today. More than 600 million were posted in the year this hall first opened to the public. They're collector's items today and give a technicolor vision of the place that came to be known as White City. It's the collectors of exhibition ephemera like Mr. Donald Knight who try to keep the memory of these fantastic shows alive.
Hello, Don, what's going on here?
Well, this is the flip flap, built for the 1908 exhibition as an attraction. It had 2 arms, 150 feet long, and for sixpence you got on one side and travelled across to the other, and it took 3 minutes 20 seconds.
And how far could you see from the top?
To the north you could see Windsor Castle on a clear day, and to the south you could see the Crystal Palace.
We went up in a modern flip-flap to where on a clear day those Edwardian crowds peered into an unpredictable future.
So here we have a view looking across towards the BBC studios, which is there today, but in 1908 was the Court of Honour. Now on the Court of Honour you could ride around the lakes and the lagoons on the swan boats or the motor launches.
So there's no trace of the canals now, is there?
No trace at all.
Can't see a thing, but it went round here somewhere.
It came around in this area that we are just above.
As you walked in, what did you see? A huge city? A fantasy city?
Saw a fantasy city, yes. It was all painted white, so it was quite something for the general public to walk in and see.
I presume it's also painted white. What's happened to the flip-flap?
We've got a slight
flip-flap problem. What about the flip-flap? It did get stuck once, didn't it?
Yeah, it got stuck at its height up there. And when the people finally got to the ground, they were given 7 and 6pence for their inconvenience. This was a lot of money in those days.
How long were they up there?
They were up there for over an hour.
Britain now had all the thrills of the funfair that the French had enjoyed in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower in 1900. Exciting then, the rides look rather quaint now. The Olympic Games took place here. They were a rather more amateur event than they are now. As usual, it rained a lot, a feature of all great British exhibitions, and they're off. Inside the White City, and not far from the Senegalese, there was a whiter-than-white village by the name of Ballymaclinton, sponsored by an Irish soap manufacturer which had some of the cleanest colleens this side of the Irish Sea. It was all patronising fiction. Today's entertainment is made on the same site. It's BBC Television Centre. And here's the only acknowledgement of the existence of the White City, a brass plaque set into a surviving patch of tiled flooring. There were 4 big shows at White City before it vanished into the carnage of the First World War. The machine guns devised by Hiram Maxim in Clerkenwell were put on show here in 1908. 6 years later they were cutting down Imperial German troops in France and Belgium. British Tommies on the way to be slaughtered marched up and down here, larking about for the cameras in 1914. The funfair rides were decommissioned at the time because so many soldiers were injured playing about on them. Today, BBC Television Centre occupies the site of the Great Court of what was once the White City. It makes sense. 90 years on, television has taken over from the great exhibitions as the most powerful and persuasive tool of propaganda, entertainment and information. Television and mass communications pulled the rug from under these phantasmagoric and numbingly popular leviathans. In an age of instant communications, of theme parks, of virtual reality, of the computer and the information superhighway, what could we possibly get from the Dome that we couldn't get at home, school or work? Here at Wembley, the notion of empire developed in 1908 became the whole purpose and agenda of the exhibitions of 1924 and 25. The site was hardly a memorable one, but it would have been if a British railway entrepreneur had succeeded in copying and then beating the greatest of all exhibition monuments. In the spirit of 1889, Wembley was to have had an Eiffel Tower of its own. The British Tower, taller of course, began to rise beside the tracks of the Great Central Railway at Wembley. It was the brainchild of the railway's chairman, Sir Edward Watkin, who dreamed of connecting London to Paris by way of a Channel tunnel. Watkin's folly never got beyond the first stage because it began to lean at a decidedly Pisan angle and the money ran out. It was demolished. The British built a concrete city here at Wembley. The architecture was nothing new, if anything much less inventive than that of White City. But this was empire. Empire had always been best expressed in classical architecture, even if this was no more than skin deep. A pediment here, lions' heads there. The biggest building of all was to be raised here as the centrepiece of the Empire exhibition. Wembley Stadium was designed by the engineer Owen Williams to hold up to 100,000 people, a concrete colossus in a concrete city. The King's opening speech was broadcast to the world. Wembley went out to Africa and India, whilst India and Africa came to Wembley. The King read a stirring speech from his stage-set throne. The throne is now in a parish church in Wembley, commandeered by the churchwarden.
Leads to a greater development of the material resources of the empire and to an expansion of its trade. It will, at the same time, be raising the economic life of the world from the disorganization caused by the war.
It was all pomp, all show. The regal splendour and the pageantry of the British Empire exhibition at Wembley was really a theatrical mask that hid the fact that British industry was in decline and that the sun was setting over the empire. The pageant of empire seems so phony to us today, as if everyone was playing a dressing-up game and shouting "Empire" when no one really believed it. The exhibition showed how our glorious troops, armed with Springfields, Lee Enfields and Maxims, triumphed over the natives of primitive lands. Looks like 1-0's the home team here. I wonder what today's multiracial football crowd would make of this kind of spectacle on Wembley's hallowed pitch. The African village was here again, this time on a massive scale, filled with Africans doing what we thought Africans ought to be doing. And here's a parade of the most beautiful women in history. There's Helen of Troy, Mary Queen of Scots, Nell Gwynn, Madame Pompadour, and Miss Wembley 1924 from the pair's Palace of Beauty, all white of course. And here's Jerry the troublesome tyke waving to the girls in the lagoon. A sixpenny ticket took millions of visitors to the exhibition on a boat ride around a lagoon that passed around the Wembley Arena there, came back along past the Empire Pavilions of Australia and New Zealand, and eventually went right round towards a fun fair, which is up there where you can see things like the tomb of Tutankhamun, or at least a virtual representation of it. What's left now? Well, not very much. Over there is the Palace of Industries, which is now a distribution depot, and over here was the great Palace of Engineering. And what's left of that now? Well, the land of leather and a comet warehouse. A rather sad end.
Boys to sail and venturous captains, love to chase the setting sun. Unless the day before you shine the dream.
The political agenda of empire set by Wembley was replaced as future exhibitions became showcases for aggressive nationalist propaganda. Other European powers were on the rise, which were to use the 1937 Paris exhibition as a cultural sledgehammer. The mighty Soviet pavilion, topped with a heroic hammer and sickle worker, faced the German pavilion, crowned with a Nazi eagle clutching a swastika. The war blew apart these grand competitive events. They weren't to disappear, but to re-emerge in a subtly reconstructed form, with the spectre of a new nationalism always in the background.
The River Thames is rightly being featured in the Festival of Britain, and the river services get off to a good start ahead of opening day when the Lord Mayor proceeds by launch from London Bridge to Charing Cross. The main purpose was to survey the South Bank exhibition from the river. 2 new stone figures named the Islanders had made their appearance in the last few days, and the exhibition looked as near ready as makes no difference.
The sheer optimism of the state-funded, state-run celebration of the British contribution to civilization gave people some hope that after 6 years of war and a further 6 of ration books and austerity, they were finally heading towards the broad, sunlit uplands promised by Churchill.
Now the great exhibition opens its doors to the cash customers, and in spite of the weather, 15,000 stream in, which annoys Jupiter Pluvius more than somewhat, and down comes the rain, mocking the man-made sun.
As the crowds queued at the turnstiles in May 1951, workers were still putting the finishing touches to this cheery and instructional, if rather wobbly, celebration of achievement. The festival looked back to the glory days of 1851 and forward to the Dome of Discovery, a grounded flying saucer celebrating Britain's pioneering role in the age of atom bombs and jet engines. It was a different Britain then. After a brief blip in history, prompted by the fight against Hitler, Britain was truly a united nation. The major utilities had been nationalised: railways, mines, gas, electricity, water. New teeth and specs came courtesy of the new National Health Service. As the Greenwich Dome stands for the diffuse might of private enterprise and free markets, the Festival of Britain was a celebration of a temporarily unified state under a paternalistic government. The festival marked the zenith of the idea of Britain as a democratic, yet disciplined, homogeneous, yet liberal nation. The festival was underpinned by a common sense of duty and decency. The talk then was of common wealth, not of commercial sponsorship. Unlike next year's Millennium Experience at Greenwich, the festival was a truly national occasion, with related events organised up and down the country. There were travelling exhibitions to take the festival message on the high seas aboard a converted aircraft carrier HMS Campania. A fleet of 100 lorries drove up and down the British Isles, and to take the message abroad, 4 publicly owned and regulated Red London double-deckers toured 4,000 miles through mainland Europe, ending up in Berlin. The festival wasn't just about promoting and exporting new ideas, it was about bricks and mortar too. It built its own model community.
Poplar's new Lansbury neighbourhood, which will be a complete little town when ready, welcomes the first tenant, Mr. Albert Snoddy, to its first completed block of flats. His old home, a stricken survivor of the Blitz, is to be pulled down in the making of another housing estate. As the Snoddies leave for their new home, Albert says farewell like a soldier. The greatest single factor for happiness these days is homes. And with this in view, Poplar plans wisely and builds well.
Was this dream misplaced? A tower for Londoners to come up and look at their perfect new world after the horrors of the Second World War? Well, I think it was misplaced. The dream was premised on a perfect, wholemeal, decent, sort of neat and ordered world for Londoners to live in. It was a dream that really came from Scandinavia. I think the architects and designers got it a bit wrong. London's never been so neat and never been so ordered.
The tower is no longer used as a vantage point. The council says it's unsafe, but the truth is that it's dangerous for those walking underneath it. Well, would you? Having been bombed out by the Luftwaffe, Mr. Snoddy was probably very grateful for his new pub, church, school and viewing tower. The Lansbury estate was partly a response to criticism accusing the festival of being ephemeral, of wasting money, when hundreds and thousands of new homes were the most pressing national need.
I think at the time we were so close to wartime discipline that we didn't realise how authoritarian it was. And also, of course, the Labour government was very authoritarian, and people did as they were told. That was what they expected.
So no change there then?
Well, some change, and some change for the better. What was Herbert Morrison? Was he Home Secretary at the time?
Yes.
He set out an edict and said, the people must be happy. I want the people to sing. And it inspired a song, a sort of a very official sounding song with a male voice choir who sang, let the people sing, sing like anything, any sort of song they choose. Tell them that we long to hear them, tell them that we want to be near them. When things all go wrong, you will find a song, welcome as a breath of spring. Therefore, let the people sing. I mean, Disasterville.
Sounds a bit Third Reichy to me.
Well, yes, it is very much authoritarian. Did the people go for that? I guess they did. I remember immense queues everywhere, and rather obedient queues. You know, Lord Reith must still have been alive in those days, because the Dome of Discovery was very instructive. When you went in, you were given your instructions that you would go round from A to B to C to D, or otherwise you wouldn't understand what it was.
Now meet Dr. Grey Walter of Bristol. Why the torch? Well, here's the reason. It's Toby, a mechanical tortoise with an electronic brain which functions like the human mind.
I had some cybernetic tortoises, and they could feed electronically. That's to say, when they were running out of power, they'd go and plug it into a power point, and then they'd zizz around the cage again. And I thought this was great. I could see this was the cutting edge of science. You know, the future was going to be in that glass cage. So I went to see it, and there were the tortoises, stationary, gathering dust in the darkness, and a big notice was plastered on the glass saying, "Out of order." British technology at its finest. Sad, really. I mean, when I think back to it, I think there was something sad about the hopes that we had for the future, that the future was actually going to be better and brighter. Perhaps for many people it was.
Flying cars, a German invention acquired by British showmen. You loop the loop inside a giant cylinder, and the small car you occupy isn't driven by motor or any other power. You simply defy the law of gravity.
For the lighter side of life, we show you this week an icebox for the girl who wants to keep fresh. See how nicely she's preserved. She's a festival funfair queen, Nikki Swift, Sweet 19 from Northampton. 8 to 12 times a day they put her back on the ice, with a towel in case the fridge starts to thaw. No air can get in once the end has been sealed, so 6 minutes is the limit of her endurance. In America, the record is 13 minutes, 28 seconds. But there, of course, they've got central heating.
Thousands of plucky Brits queued for hours in the cold to stand on a brass ring in the ground to peer up at the underside of the Skylon. The Skylon was perhaps the most futuristic structure built for any British exhibition since the Crystal Palace. It was certainly the most ethereal. If you looked too closely, it seemed to disappear. Which of course it did, almost as soon as the exhibition closed in 1951. Clement Attlee's Labour government was voted out of power at the end of the year. Churchill, who saw the festival as three-dimensional socialist propaganda, had it destroyed immediately he moved into number 10 again. He wanted it forgotten as soon as possible.
Minister of Works, Mr. Eccles, comes along to see for himself. Already the Dome of Discovery has lost its roof, but all in a good cause. Its metal, plus that from all the other festival buildings now being demolished, will help ease the critical state of Britain's stocks of scrap metal.
Taking us into the 21st century, around a bend in the River Thames, is the Millennium Experience, which will be housed for the most part in Richard Rogers' Dome. It was a Tory project at first, but this time round a new Labour government, rather than squishing the thing, inflated it beyond all political expectation. In a sense, it's a return to where we started, an exhibition that's meant to be held under one roof. Great exhibitions come and go. This pub was built long before the Crystal Palace, and I expect it will be here long after the Dome has closed. What legacy do these exhibitions leave us? We remember the Crystal Palace with its simple message of trade and industry, and the museums it left in its wake. But who now remembers the British Empire exhibition with its call to duty and empire, or the White City of 1908? All we remember are postcards, snatches of songs, newsreels, commemorative jugs and souvenir saucers, a few sad old sheds. Fundamentally, great exhibitions are national fantasies, to do with ideology or entertainment. They're national mind games, all smoke and mirrors. They become the stuff of dreams.